space. Something is waiting tonight. Midnight Lore tells the entire dead space timeline. Every horror, every secret, every truth about the markers, narrated slowly, just for tonight. If this is your kind of story, the channel has more. Subscribe, and let the darkness find you again.
Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. This story is in no hurry. We begin very far back, not with space stations, not with dark corridors, not with the horrors waiting in the shadows. We begin with a planet you know, with Earth, with humanity at a moment when it had no idea what price it would eventually pay for its own survival. This is a story about a civilization that made a choice, and how that choice led it to the edge of an abyss. Picture Earth somewhere around the 22nd century, not the way you know it now, green, alive, relatively peaceful. No, picture a planet that is suffocating. By that time, Earth's population had grown to numbers that are difficult to even say out loud. Billions of people, concentrated in massive megacities stretching from horizon to horizon. Cities where buildings stand on top of other buildings. Streets where daylight barely reaches through the overhanging layers of infrastructure above. The air is heavy, the soil is depleted, the resources nearly gone. Humanity had always been good at finding a way out. It always found new lands, new sources, new solutions. But this time, the planet had run out of room. Oil, exhausted. Coal, exhausted. Rare metals needed for electronics, for weapons, for everything modern civilization depends on. Either depleted or buried so deep that extracting them costs more than what you get in return. This was not a sudden crisis. It was a slow, inevitable, well-documented collapse. Scientists warned about it. Economists warned about it. But civilization, as it always does, kept moving forward, hoping that someone else would solve the problem. And then came the moment when the problem had to be solved right now. By that time, the structure of power on Earth had changed significantly. Traditional nation-states still existed, flags, anthems, borders on maps. But real power had increasingly shifted into the hands of large corporations. This didn't happen overnight. It was a process stretched over decades. First, corporations simply got bigger. Then they became more important to national economies. Then, indispensable. And you don't fire the indispensable. You don't regulate them the same way you do everyone else. Among all the corporations of that era, one occupied a particularly special place. CEC, the Concordance Extraction Corporation. In short, CEC dealt in resource extraction. But that short version doesn't capture even a tenth of what this organization actually was. CEC had its own fleet, its own army, its own legal system for governing relations with workers on distant outposts. In essence, it was a state within a state, just without the need to hold elections or explain its decisions to the public. For an Earth suffocating from resource scarcity, CEC was a lifeline, and CEC knew that very well. Around this same time, a technology was born that would change everything, a technology they called Planetcracking. The idea was so massive in scale that the first public announcements were met with disbelief. People thought it was science fiction, but CEC's engineers were not joking. The concept was simple in its brutal logic. If the resources on a planet's surface are gone, get what's inside. Everything inside. Down to the last bit. And planet cracking is the process of literally dismantling a planet piece by piece. Giant machines, the size of small cities, descend onto the surface of a planet or asteroid. They drill, they melt, they cut. They tear out layers of rock and process them into pure raw materials. And what remains, the molten core, the tectonic debris, is simply cast off into space. This is not mining. This is the destruction of a planet for the sake of what's inside it. The first major public success of planet cracking was an operation on a small rocky asteroid somewhere in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. CEC extracted enough rare metals from it to cover the needs of 10 of Earth's largest megacities for an entire year. Earth applauded. Governments signed contracts. Nobody thought to ask, what if there's something else inside? To carry out planet-cracking operations at the scale Earth needed, CEC built a fleet. Not just a fleet of ships, a fleet of entire cities moving through space. The largest and most important units of this fleet were the planet crackers. These were enormous vessels, several kilometers in length, capable of carrying all the necessary crew, equipment, processing facilities, and supplies for missions lasting many years. But the most famous of all the planet crackers, the one whose name you will hear throughout this story, was the USG Ishimura. The USG Ishimura, the first of her kind, the largest, the oldest, a legend of the CEC fleet. Built in 2446, the Ishimura became a symbol of human ambition and technological power. Her name honored Dr. Hideki Ishimura, one of the pioneers of planet-cracking technology, and the ship was named after a person to emphasize a point. This was not just a machine. This was an achievement. The Ishimura could carry nearly 800 crew members. She had her own medical bays, her own quarters, her own parks with artificial lighting. People could live aboard her for years without ever needing to return to Earth. For decades she drifted through the galaxy, cracking planets and enriching CEC. She was considered unsinkable. She was considered safe. But all of that was before a certain moment. Before the moment we'll talk about later. The year is approximately 2214. Humanity has already settled the moon. There are bases, research stations, mines. The moon at that point is almost routine. But one research mission stumbles upon something unusual in one of the craters, and something with no natural explanation whatsoever. An object, monolithic, dark, made from a material that human instruments could not identify. Several meters tall, its shape resembled an obelisk, hence the name. But the true remarkable quality of the obelisk was not its shape or its material. It was what it did. The object emitted a signal. Not radio waves, something else. Something that instruments could detect but not classify. Something that affected the people standing near it. The first researchers described their experiences in different ways. Some talked about voices. Others described visions, or a feeling of unity with something greater. Some became extraordinarily calm and peaceful. Others became excited, almost euphoric. One researcher wrote in his personal journal, "I felt that I understood something fundamental about the nature of existence. something I cannot put into words. The government immediately took the discovery under strict control. Information about the obelisk was classified, officially for the safety of the research, unofficially because nobody knew what to do with it and nobody wanted a public panic. Research continued for years. The obelisk was studied, scanned, analyzed, but it did not give up its secrets easily. This is where a man steps onto the stage without whom this entire story would look very different. Dr. Michael Altman, an anthropologist and linguist who worked as part of one of the research teams studying the obelisk. In the 2019s, Altman was intelligent, charismatic, and, as it turned out, most importantly, not inclined to stay silent when he believed society had a right to know the truth. During his time working near the obelisk, Altman experienced what all the researchers did, that strange feeling of unity, the visions, the voices. But he, unlike most of his colleagues, was not frightened by it. He didn't dismiss it as hallucination or psychological noise. He tried to make sense of it, to interpret it, to place it within some larger framework. And he arrived at a conclusion that turned his entire worldview upside down. The obelisk, or the marker, as he began to call it, was a message from something or someone far older and far greater than humanity. A message about the unity of all living things, about the nature of the universe, about the idea that death is not an ending but a transformation, a return to something whole. Altman began writing down his thoughts, at first as scientific notes, then as something more personal, more philosophical, and then he did something nobody expected. He went public. The information reached the public. Photographs of the obelisk, excerpts from research reports, and, most importantly, Altman's personal writings spread across the network. The reaction of society was unpredictably varied. Some people were frightened. Some decided it was a hoax or a government conspiracy. Some simply shrugged. In a world where crises happen every day, one strange object on the moon didn't seem like a priority. But some people, and there turned out to be far more of them than anyone expected, felt something entirely different, something like recognition, as though they had been searching for exactly this their whole lives and had finally found it. People who read Altman's writings and felt that resonance began to gather together. At first, informally, online, in small groups. They discussed his ideas, developed them, added their own interpretations. The central idea was simple and yet immense. The marker was proof that a higher principle existed in the universe, that all living beings were connected at a fundamental level, that death was not destruction but transformation, a return to a single whole. They called themselves Unitology, from unity. Unitology grew quickly, from an informal movement into an organized structure. Leaders emerged. A hierarchy formed. Official texts were written. Churches were built. Followers joined, first hundreds, and then thousands, then millions. But Michael Altman himself never got to see how large the movement born from his words would become. He died under unclear circumstances shortly after the information went public. The official version called it an accident. His followers never believed that. Instead, they did what people always do with their fallen heroes. They made him a martyr, a saint, a man who died for the truth. The irony was that Altman himself, based on his own writings, almost certainly would not have wanted this. He was searching for knowledge, not worship. He wanted to understand the marker, not turn it into an object of religious devotion. But the dead cannot object, and Unitology took what it needed. By the mid-23rd century, Unitology had become one of the most influential religious organizations in all of known human space. Structurally, it resembled a combination of a traditional church and a corporation. On the outside, open, accessible, with an attractive message about unity and immortality. On the inside, rigidly hierarchical, with clear levels of initiation and strict discipline. Joining Unitology was easy. Leaving was far harder. The organization actively recruited among people experiencing crises, those who had lost loved ones, those suffering from illness, those without hope. It offered comfort, answers to questions about death and meaning, community, and the promise of something greater. It offered hope. In return, a gradual, almost imperceptible transfer of control over one's own life into the hands of the organization. Financially, Unitology became extraordinarily powerful. Membership dues, donations, and business ventures allowed it to maintain an army of clergy, build lavish churches on every colony, and lobby its interests through the corridors of EarthGov. And most importantly, Unitology had a goal. One specific, all-encompassing goal that defined everything else. The marker, the very same obelisk found on the moon, remained in the hands of EarthGov, classified, guarded, inaccessible. For Unitologists, this was unbearable. In their understanding, the marker was a sacred object, a message from a higher power, a key to understanding the nature of the universe and the path to unity and immortality. They wanted access to it. They wanted to study it. They wanted to understand its message and make it real. What exactly they meant by making the message real, that was something most rank-and-file Unitologists didn't know. The upper levels of the hierarchy kept that knowledge to themselves. But this goal, the return of the marker, became an increasingly central part of Unitology's doctrine, and it increasingly defined the relationship between the Church and EarthGov. This is what the world looked like on the eve of the events we are about to explore. Earth, exhausted but still functioning, sustained by the flow of resources from CEC and planet-cracking operations across the galaxy. EarthGov, the official authority, holding the secret of the markers, trying to maintain control over a situation it doesn't fully understand. CEC, a corporate giant, pushing its fleet across the galaxy in search of new planets to crack open, and not asking too many questions. Unitology, a religious organization with millions of faithful, enormous resources, and one sacred objective, the return of the marker. And somewhere in space, ships, stations, colonies, hundreds of thousands of people living their ordinary lives, not suspecting that all of these forces, government, corporation, religion, and an ancient secret, are already moving toward a single point of collision, toward a point of no return. In the next part, we'll talk about what scientists discovered at the heart of the markers, about the technology they tried to recreate, and about the planet Aegis VII, the place where everything began. Sleep well. We're in no hurry. Welcome back. Get comfortable again. Let the world outside fade away. In the last part, we talked about how humanity stretched itself thin across the stars, how corporations like CEC became the true powers behind civilization, and how a mysterious object found on the moon gave birth to one of the most powerful religious movements in human history. Now we go deeper. Now we start pulling on the threads that lead directly to the nightmare. For decades after the discovery of the obelisk on the moon, government scientists studied it in secret. Classified facilities, restricted access, the kind of research that never appears in academic journals. The marker. And by now, researchers had found traces of similar objects in multiple locations, was not a natural formation, and there was no geological or chemical process that could explain its existence. It was constructed, deliberately, with extraordinary precision, down to a molecular level. The material it was made from had no match in any known database. It did not corrode. It did not react to heat or radiation in any predictable way. Under certain kinds of scanning, it appeared to absorb the energy directed at it, rather than reflect it. But the most unsettling discovery was not about the material. It was about the signal. The marker emitted a continuous, low-level signal. Not radio waves, not electromagnetic radiation in any conventional sense. Something that instruments could detect but not classify. And this signal did things to people. Researchers who spent extended time near the marker reported a range of experiences. At low exposure, a deep sense of calm, almost meditative, a feeling of being connected to something much larger than themselves. Some reported hearing faint sounds on the verge of becoming language. At higher exposure, the effects became more intense. Vivid hallucinations, dreams that felt more real than waking life, a compulsive need to return to the marker, and in a small number of cases quietly buried in classified reports, psychological breakdown, obsessive behavior, paranoia, researchers who attempted to harm themselves or others. The official response was to increase safety protocols and classify the reports more deeply. The unofficial response among the researchers was a quiet, growing fear that they were dealing with something they fundamentally did not understand. Encoded within the physical structure of the marker itself, within the microscopic surface patterns, within the molecular arrangement of its material, there was information. Not random information, not noise. Structured, deliberate, extraordinarily complex information. It took years to even recognize it as a message. It took more years to begin decoding it. And what the scientists eventually found, buried inside that alien architecture, was a blueprint for something they could build. The markers encoded information appeared to describe a process, a technology, related to the fundamental nature of biological matter, to the boundary between life and death, to the possibility of a transformation that went far beyond anything human science had previously imagined. Whether the scientists who first decoded this truly understood what they were looking at is unclear. What is clear is that they decided to try to build it. The original marker found on the moon was designated the black marker, named for the deep, almost lightless quality of its surface. The project to replicate it produced what came to be known as red markers, named for their slightly different coloration, a result of using different materials since humanity could not exactly replicate the original's alien composition. The Red Marker project was among the most classified undertakings in EarthGov history. Officially, the goal was research and understanding, to decode the marker's message and perhaps harness it for humanity's benefit. The red markers, once constructed and activated, reproduced the signal of the original, and they reproduced its side effects, the same calm at low exposure, the same visions at medium exposure, the same psychological deterioration at high exposure. And something else. In the areas around active markers, dead biological tissue underwent changes that defied normal biology, active, organized changes, driven by a kind of purpose that living biology did not possess. Some researchers began using a word in their private notes that they avoided in official reports. Reanimation. The reports were classified. The experiments continued. Now we arrive at a specific place. A rocky, geologically active world in a remote system. Not particularly remarkable by planetary survey standards, but deep beneath its crust, preliminary scans suggested enormous deposits of raw materials. Exactly the kind of thing that made CEC's eyes light up. And there was just one complication. There was already a marker there. Not the black marker that remained in government hands. This was different, older. A natural marker buried deep in the rock of Aegis VII, as though the planet itself had grown around it over millions of years. The discovery complicated everything. EarthGov wanted controlled study. CEC wanted to crack the planet open. Neither side got exactly what they wanted. The compromise was a colony. A colony would be established on Aegis VII, serving as both a research facility and a staging ground for the eventual planet-cracking operation. At its peak, it housed around 1,000 people, miners, engineers, scientists, medical staff, and their families. Some of them were Unitologists. Being near the marker gave the local Unitologist community a particular intensity, and they knew what was there. Living in its presence was, for many of them, a profound spiritual experience. As the colony settled in, the same patterns documented elsewhere began to emerge. People living near the marker's signal reported improved sleep, a sense of well-being, a feeling of calm clarity. Productivity was high, morale was good. The Unitologists among the colonists interpreted this as confirmation of everything their faith had taught them. What the research team's instruments quietly recorded told a different story. The signal was growing stronger, slowly, steadily, but measurably. And as it grew stronger, the well-being began to be accompanied by other things. More vivid dreams, reports of seeing things that weren't there. Small disagreements escalating to unusual violence. Workers staring at walls, are speaking in fragmented phrases, walking to parts of the colony they had no reason to visit. The research team flagged these observations. EarthGov reviewed them, classified them, and sent back instructions to continue observation and maintain current operational status. The colony continued. As things deteriorated on Aegis VII, the Unitologist members of the colony responded in a way that outsiders found difficult to comprehend. They did not try to flee. They tried to stay. In their understanding, whatever was happening was not a catastrophe. It was a fulfillment. The marker's signal had always promised unity, a return to something greater than individual existence. The visions, the voices, the transformations. To the true believers, these were not signs of danger. They were signs that the promise was being kept. The Church of Unitology, as an institution, had always taught that the marker held the key to transcendence, that death, properly understood, was not an ending, but a doorway, that the signal was a gift, and those who surrendered to it fully would be rewarded with a form of existence beyond anything the merely living could comprehend. What the Unitologists didn't fully understand, what even the highest levels of Unitology's hierarchy may not have truly grasped, was the precise nature of what that transformation actually looked like. The doctrine promised unity, peace, transcendence. The reality of what the marker produced was something far more horrifying. But belief is powerful, and for the Unitologists on Aegis VII, belief was enough to keep them at their post long after every rational instinct said to run. Some of them actively assisted in the spread of the infection, seeing it as a sacred duty. Others simply stayed, waiting for their own transformation, certain that whatever came next would be worth it. They were among the last to die. Whether they considered that a comfort, we cannot know. The man nominally in command of the Ishimura during these events was Captain Benjamin Matthews. Matthias was an experienced officer. He had served on deep space operations for decades, had overseen multiple planet-cracking missions, and was by all accounts a competent and respected commander. He was also a Unitologist, a fact that had not been considered a disqualifying characteristic when he was assigned to this mission, since Unitology was a legal and widespread religion with millions of followers. But as the situation on the Ishimura began to deteriorate, Matthias found himself torn between his duty as a captain and the convictions of his faith. He was not entirely ignorant of what the marker was, or of the significance of bringing it aboard. He had been given more information than most of the crew, though still not the full picture. And his Unitologist beliefs shaped how he interpreted what he was seeing. When crew members began showing symptoms, the hallucinations, the paranoia, the violent episodes, Matthias was slow to respond in ways that might have contained the outbreak. He hesitated to quarantine, hesitated to raise alarms, hesitated to take actions that his faith told him were unnecessary resistance to something sacred. By the time he understood that what was happening had moved far beyond any framework his beliefs had prepared him for, it was too late. His fate, like that of most of the Ishimura's crew, was sealed before the Kellyan ever arrived. Dr. Quine and the research team, among those aboard the Ishimura who had been given more information than the average crew member, was Dr. Chalice Mercer, the ship's chief science officer, and a man named Dr. Terence Kine, the ship's chief medical officer. Both men had known before the mission began more about the marker than most. Both had been part of the official research apparatus that had been studying marker technology. And both, as the situation on the Ishimura collapsed, responded in very different ways. Mercer was a Unitologist of deep conviction. As the Necromorph outbreak spread, he became convinced that what he was witnessing was not a disaster to be stopped, but an evolution to be embraced. He began making decisions, terrible decisions, based on a belief that the Necromorphs were the next stage of human existence, that to interfere with the process was to interfere with the divine plan of the marker. Kine went in the opposite direction. As a scientist, and as a man who had studied the marker data more carefully than most, he came to understand something crucial. The outbreak could potentially be stopped. The marker, if returned to the planet's surface, might reabsorb the signal and halt the spread of the necromorphs. It was a theory, not a certainty, but it was the closest thing to a solution that existed. Kine became obsessed with this goal, getting the marker off the ship, returning it to Aegis VII, ending what had been started. He was still alive when the Kellion arrived, barely, and he would play a role in what happened next. Somewhere far from Aegis VII, a man named Isaac Clarke was living his own quiet life. Isaac was a systems engineer, the kind of person who fixes the things that make space stations and ships actually function. Electrical systems, mechanical systems, environmental controls, the invisible infrastructure that keeps people alive in the void. He was good at his job, practical, methodical, capable of staying calm under pressure. Not a soldier, not a scientist, not a politician. Just a man who understood machines. Isaac had a personal connection to Aegis VII. His girlfriend, a woman named Nicole Brennan, was the chief medical officer aboard the USG Ishimura, and which had been assigned to conduct the planet-cracking operation there. She had sent him a message before the ship entered communication blackout, a message that seemed distressed and fragmented, one that didn't fully make sense. He hadn't been able to reach her since. He was worried, and when an emergency distress signal reached the small maintenance ship he was traveling on, the USG Kellion, Isaac found himself heading directly toward the place he had been trying to reach anyway. He didn't know what had happened on the Ishimura. He just knew Nicole was there and he needed to find her. The Ishimura had been sent to crack Aegis VII, but her assignment carried a hidden second purpose: to retrieve the marker from the planet's surface and transport it to a controlled research environment. A decision made at the highest levels of government without informing most of the crew. The extraction did not go smoothly. By the time the retrieval team arrived on the surface, the colony was already falling apart. The signal had been growing. The psychological effects had been intensifying. There had been violence. There had been deaths. And among the dead, the signal had been doing something else entirely. The marker's energy reanimated dead biological tissue, not back into life as we know it, into something else, something transformed at a fundamental level, restructured and reorganized by the signal into creatures that were no longer human, no longer recognizable, but horrifyingly, relentlessly active. These were the Necromorphs, dead forms, things shaped from death. They were not zombies in any traditional sense, and their limbs were repositioned, their bone structure altered, new appendages grown from tissue that had no business forming appendages. They were fast, resilient in ways that defied expectation. Conventional weapons aimed at killing zones had little effect, and they spread. Each new body that died in proximity became potential new material. The marker was brought aboard the Ishimura regardless. Orders were clear, and whatever the marker had been doing to the colony on Aegis VII, it began doing on the Ishimura too. The crew didn't understand what was happening. There was no frame of reference for this. They tried to fight. They tried to contain it. They failed. One by one, the sections of the Ishimura fell. One by one, the crew was lost. The massive ship, pride of the CEC fleet, went dark. No communications, no response to hails, no explanation. just silence. And somewhere, an engineer named Isaac Clarke received the last fragmented message from a woman named Nicole. He didn't know that by the time he read it, the ship she was on had already become something unimaginable. The USG Kellyan was heading toward the Ishimura. Isaac Clarke was on board. The next part of our story begins the moment it arrives. Sleep well. We are only just beginning. Welcome back. Settle in. Let everything else go quiet. In the last part, we watched a colony fall apart. We watched a ship go dark. We watched a man named Isaac Clarke board a small vessel heading toward the silence, not knowing what waited for him on the other side of it. This part is his story, the first chapter of it anyway. It begins the moment the USG Kellyan comes within visual range of the USG Ishimura, and it does not let up for a long time. The USG Kellyan was a small ship, a maintenance and repair vessel, the kind dispatched when a larger ship stops responding, and someone needs to go find out why. Its crew was small, a handful of people, none of them soldiers, none of them prepared for what they were about to find. Among them was Isaac Clarke, systems engineer, a quiet man with a practical mind and a personal reason for being here. As the Kellyan approached the Ishimura, the size of the larger ship became apparent through the viewport. Even in a state of complete systems failure, even dark and silent and drifting, the Ishimura was an imposing presence. Several kilometers of steel and machinery hanging in the black like a dead city. The crew of the Kellyan attempted to make contact. No response. They attempted to dock. The automated docking systems were non-functional. They were forced to attempt a manual approach, which went wrong almost immediately. The Kellyan was caught by the Ishimura's damaged landing mechanisms and pulled in hard. A crash landing rather than a controlled docking. The ship was damaged beyond immediate use. The crew had no way to leave. Whatever was on the Ishimura, they were now locked in with it. The initial moments inside the Ishimura were disorienting in the way that only deep abandonment can be. The lights were on emergency backup, dim, flickering, casting everything in a red-tinged half-darkness. The air was breathable but stale. Surfaces that should have been clean were not. Personal effects were scattered in the corridors as though people had simply stopped mid-task and walked away, or been taken mid-task and not walked anywhere at all. There were sounds, distant ones, hard to locate. Sounds that didn't belong to any system malfunction Isaac had ever encountered professionally. The crew moved cautiously, trying to reach the bridge, trying to find someone in authority, trying to understand what had happened. They found the communications room. They found signs of violence, blood on the walls, equipment smashed. They found no living people. And then they found the first Necromorph. It did not go well for everyone. In the chaos of that first encounter, the crew of the Kellyan was separated. Some were killed immediately. Others were taken, dragged away into the dark of the ship's corridors in directions that made no tactical sense, deeper into the Ishimura rather than toward any exit. Isaac was separated from the others and found himself alone, alive, equipped with little more than the tools of his trade, engineering instruments not designed as weapons in a ship full of things that wanted to kill him. This is where Isaac Clarke's story truly begins. What follows, over the course of Isaac's time on the Ishimura, eyes a sustained ordeal that tests every limit of human endurance. Isaac Clarke was not a trained combatant. He was not a Marine, not a security officer, not someone who had ever expected to fight for his life in the corridors of a dead ship. What he had was engineering knowledge, practical intelligence, and the particular kind of stubborn functionality that keeps a person moving when every reasonable instinct says to stop. He improvised. His engineering tools, plasma cutters, line guns, force guns, turned out to be brutally effective against necromorphs in ways conventional weapons were not. Because the key to stopping a necromorph was not destroying its center mass, but dismembering its limbs, cutting off the appendages that drove it forward, removing its capacity to move rather than simply damaging its body. Isaac figured this out. He adapted. He kept moving. Through the Ishimura's medical decks, its engineering sections, its hydroponics bays and crew quarters, and research labs and mining platforms. Isaac moved through the ship the way water moves through rock, finding the paths that were open, working around the ones that weren't, always pushing forward. He was looking for Nicole. That was the center of everything for him. The reason he kept going when stopping would have been so much easier. The Ishimura, despite being overrun, was not entirely without its original infrastructure. Many of the ship's automated systems were still partially functional. Airlocks, trams, internal communications. And the rig system, the resource integration gear, the standard issue suit worn by all CEC personnel, provided Isaac with critical support. The rig was more than protective armor. It was an integrated life support and information system. It monitored Isaac's vital signs, displayed his health status along his spine in glowing bars of light, managed his oxygen supply in vacuum environments, and provided a heads-up display for navigation and communication. It also stored recorded messages. And through the rig, Isaac began receiving communications from the few survivors still alive on the Ishimura. The first was Zach Hammond, the ship's executive officer from the Kellion, who had survived the initial chaos and was trying to maintain some semblance of command and order in an environment where neither was possible. The second was Kendra Daniels, a computer systems expert from the Kellion crew, sharp and analytical, focused on finding a way off the ship. And then there was Dr. Kine, the Ishimura's chief medical officer, the man we mentioned in the last part, the one who had come to understand that returning the marker to Aegis VII might be the only way to stop what was happening. These three voices guided Isaac through the Ishimura. Sometimes their guidance was accurate and helpful. Sometimes, as he would come to understand, it was not entirely what it appeared to be. Isaac found Nicole's recorded log scattered through the ship's systems. Messages she had left in the days before the final collapse, trying to document what was happening, trying to make sense of it from a medical perspective. The logs were disturbing. Nicole described the progression of the outbreak from a clinical standpoint, but underneath the clinical language there was fear and exhaustion and grief. She had tried to help the infected. She had tried to understand what was happening to them. She had watched people she knew become things she didn't recognize. Her final log was fragmented, distressed. It was the message Isaac had received before the Ishimura went dark, the one that had brought him here. He kept moving toward her, toward the medical bay where she had last been stationed, toward wherever in this ship she might still be. We will come back to what he found. As Isaac moved through the ship, he began to understand, piece by piece, from logs and recordings and the testimony of the survivors, what had actually happened. The marker had been brought aboard. It was housed in a specially constructed containment area deep in the Ishimura's engineering section, and it was still active and still broadcasting its signal throughout the ship. The necromorphs, Isaac came to understand, were not random. They were not simply the dead rising without purpose. They were organized in a terrifying way, directed at some level by the marker's signal. The signal created them, sustained them, and in some incomprehensible way seemed to guide them toward a purpose that human minds were not equipped to understand. Removing the marker from the ship, returning it to Aegis VII, as Dr. Kine had theorized, seemed like the key to stopping the outbreak. This became Isaac's mission, not just to find Nicole, not just to survive, but to get the marker off the Ishimura. Not everyone on the Ishimura wanted the outbreak stopped. Dr. Chalice Mercer, the ship's chief science officer and devoted unitologist, had watched the spread of the necromorphs with something closer to awe than horror. In his mind, shaped by decades of unitologist doctrine, what he was witnessing was not a catastrophe. It was a revelation, the marker's promise of unity. The unitologist's belief that all living things would one day be reunited in a single transcendent whole. Mercer believed he was watching it happen in real time. The necromorphs, in his interpretation, were not monsters. They were the next stage, the transformed, the unified. He began to actively interfere with Isaac's progress. Not always directly. Mercer was a scientist, not a fighter. But by manipulating the Ishimura's systems, by releasing necromorphs into areas Isaac was trying to reach, by sabotaging efforts at containment. He was a deeply disturbed man by this point. The marker's signal had worked on him for a long time, and whatever rational framework he had once possessed had been thoroughly dismantled. He was not evil in any conventional sense. He was lost, consumed by a belief system that had taken everything good in him and twisted it into something unrecognizable. His confrontation with Isaac was inevitable. It did not end well for Mercer. At certain points during his time on the Ishimura, Isaac had to descend to the surface of Aegis VII itself. If the Ishimura was a tomb, Aegis VII was something older and worse. The colony, the 1,000 or so people who had lived and worked there, was gone. What remained were the structures they had built, now silent and broken, and the things that moved through those structures in the dark. The surface of Aegis VII was geologically unstable. The planet-cracking operation had already begun before everything went wrong, and the planet's tectonic structure had been compromised. The ground shifted. Sections of the colony had collapsed. The sky, viewed through the colony's environmental domes, had the particular quality of a place that was dying. The marker was here, partially embedded in the rock, enormous up close in a way that photographs and descriptions had not prepared Isaac for. Ancient, patient, indifferent to everything happening around it in the way that only something truly cosmically old could be indifferent. Isaac had to interact with it, getting close to it, working near it. was an experience that did things to his perception, things he couldn't always distinguish from reality, and he completed what needed to be done on the surface and returned to the ship. He carried the experience with him in ways he wouldn't fully understand until much later. Throughout his ordeal on the Ishimura, Isaac had relied on Kendra Daniels as one of his primary contacts, a voice of reason and technical expertise in an environment with very little of either. But Kendra was not exactly what she had presented herself as. As the situation moved toward its conclusion, as Isaac finally achieved the goal of getting the marker positioned for return to the planet's surface, Kendra's true purpose was revealed. She was an agent, working not for CEC, not for the survivors of the crew, but for EarthGov, specifically for the classified division of EarthGov that had been running the marker research program from the beginning. Her mission had never been to help Isaac survive or to stop the outbreak. Her mission was to retrieve the marker, to bring it back to EarthGov, where the research program could continue under controlled conditions. She took the marker. She activated an evacuation shuttle. She left. Isaac watched her go with very little ability to stop it. We have been circling around this. It is time to address it directly. Isaac found Nicole. Or rather, Isaac found what had become of Nicole. She had not survived the outbreak. She had died, alone in the medical bay, in circumstances that her final log made clear without spelling out, unable to help the people around her, unable to stop what was happening at the end. But the marker's signal had done what the marker's signal did. And Nicole, or something wearing Nicole's face and moving in the patterns of Nicole's memory, had been present in Isaac's perception throughout his time on the ship. The visions, the glimpses of her in corridors she shouldn't have been in, the communications that seemed to come from her. The marker had been generating them, using Isaac's memories, his grief, his desperate need to believe she was alive, as a tool to keep him moving, to keep him doing what the marker needed done. Whether this constitutes cruelty on the marker's part depends on whether you believe the marker has intentions. What it demonstrates, at minimum, is that the marker's signal could reach into a human mind and find the most vulnerable place in it and press. Isaac understood this eventually. What it cost him to understand it is a different kind of accounting. Despite everything, despite Kendra's betrayal, despite the revelation about Nicole, despite the physical and psychological toll of everything the Ishimura had put him through, Isaac was not finished. Kendra had taken the marker, but the shuttle she had used to escape was still accessible, and the marker, once brought back to the surface of Aegis VII, would do what Dr. Kine had theorized. Its signal would begin to pull the Necromorphs back, to draw the infestation toward itself, containing it, reabsorbing it. Isaac went after her. On the surface of Aegis VII, in the ruins of the colony, Isaac confronted Kendra. The confrontation was brief and terrible, and ended not because of anything Isaac did, but because of what emerged from the darkness behind her. The hive mind. If the Necromorphs were individual manifestations of the marker's signal, the hive mind was something else. A massive, ancient convergence of transformed biological matter, enormous beyond easy description. Something that had been building in the depths of Aegis VII long before the colony was ever established. Perhaps for far longer than that. It was the culmination of what the marker had been working toward on this planet. The end state of the transformation process. A singular, terrible organism assembled from countless individual dead, driven by a purpose that dwarfed anything happening on the surface. Kendra died. The hive mind turned its attention to Isaac. What followed was a confrontation that, by any reasonable standard, Isaac Clarke should not have survived. He was an engineer, exhausted, injured, alone on the surface of a dying planet, facing something that had no equivalent in any frame of reference he possessed. He survived anyway. He destroyed the hive mind. He found an escape shuttle. He launched. The immediate aftermath was silence. Isaac Clarke, alone in an escape pod, drifting away from Aegis VII and the wreckage of everything that had happened there. Alive, barely, carrying everything he had seen and done and lost in the ship behind him. The Ishimura was still there, dark and drifting. The colony on Aegis VII was gone. The hive mind was destroyed. The marker had been returned to the surface. The outbreak, at least in this location, appeared to be contained. But Kendra had transmitted data before she died. Data about the marker, about the Red Marker project, about everything that had been kept secret. And EarthGov still existed, still had its research program, still had its classified divisions and its classified agendas, and its belief that the marker's technology was something that could be understood and controlled. They had learned nothing. Or rather, they had learned things and had decided that the learning was worth the cost. Isaac drifted. He was found. He was taken to a medical facility. The story did not end here. It never ends where it seems like it should. In the next part, we follow Isaac to the Sprawl, a massive civilian station orbiting Saturn, and into the events of Dead Space 2, where everything he survived on the Ishimura comes back for him in ways he never anticipated. Sleep well. You are safe here. The dark outside is just the dark. Welcome back. Take a breath. Let your body get heavy. Isaac Clarke survived the Ishimura. That much we know. He got off the ship, got off the planet, drifted in an escape pod until someone found him. By any measure, he had done the impossible. Gone into a place where everyone else had died and come out the other side. But surviving something and being finished with it are very different things. And Isaac Clarke was far from finished. This part of the story takes place 3 years later, on a station called the Sprawl, and it begins not with action, but with a question. A question about what is real and what the mind does when it has seen too much. In the 3 years between the Ishimura and what happens next, Isaac Clarke was not living freely. He was in a medical and psychiatric facility on the Sprawl, a massive civilian space station built into the remains of a shattered moon of Saturn, the moon Titan. The Sprawl was one of the largest human habitations outside of Earth itself. Hundreds of thousands of people lived and worked there. It had hospitals and schools and markets and all the ordinary infrastructure of a functioning city, suspended in the rings of Saturn. Isaac had been brought there after his rescue, officially for medical treatment and psychological evaluation, unofficially because EarthGov wanted him, wanted what was in his head, the knowledge he had accumulated on the Ishimura, the experience of the marker, the things he had seen and done and somehow survived. He had been in their custody for 3 years, subjected to interrogation and evaluation and though the word was never used officially, a form of controlled exploitation. Sessions designed to extract information from his memory and his psychological state while keeping him just stable enough to continue being useful. He had not been told this directly. He had been told he was receiving treatment, that he was being helped. He was not entirely well. That was genuinely true. What he had been through on the Ishimura had left marks that no amount of time in a medical facility was going to erase cleanly. He had nightmares. He had episodes. He heard Nicole's voice sometimes, and didn't always know whether what he was perceiving was real. The marker's signal, it turned out, did not stop affecting a person just because they left its physical proximity. It left something behind, an imprint, or a kind of ongoing presence in the neural architecture of people who had been exposed to it for long enough. Isaac had been very close to the marker for a very long time. The events of Dead Space 2 begin with Isaac waking up. He wakes in a straitjacket, in a room in the psychiatric ward of the Sprawl's medical facility. The last thing he clearly remembers is the Ishimura. The 3 years between then and now are fragmented, unclear, a side effect of the treatments he had been subjected to, of the marker's ongoing influence on his memory, or both. A woman appears and helps him get free. Her name is Dinah Le Guin. She seems to know who he is, seems to want to help him, seems to have a plan. She tells him he needs to get to her location, and she can explain everything. And then, before Isaac can ask many questions, the facility around him erupts into chaos. The Necromorphs are here, on the Sprawl, among hundreds of thousands of civilians, in a station with nowhere to run. The outbreak on the Sprawl had not been accidental, not in the way accidents usually are. It had been, in a terrible sense, the result of EarthGov's own program. The research into marker technology had continued in the 3 years since the Ishimura. EarthGov's classified division had been working with a marker, a new one, a red marker constructed on the Sprawl itself, as part of their ongoing effort to understand and eventually harness the technology. They had believed they had better controls this time, better safety protocols, the benefit of hard lessons learned from what happened on the Ishimura. They had been wrong, in the particular way that people are wrong when they believe that understanding a danger makes them immune to it. The marker on the Sprawl had been doing what markers do, broadcasting its signal, affecting the people around it, slowly building toward the same inevitability that had consumed the Ishimura and Aegis VII before it. The researchers had monitored the symptoms and told themselves they had it under control, right up until the moment they didn't. By the time Isaac woke up, the Sprawl was already several hours into a catastrophic Necromorph outbreak. The station's population, those who hadn't already been transformed, was in a state of terminal panic. Emergency bulkheads were failing. Communication systems were overwhelmed, and the civil authority had no framework for dealing with what was happening, because nothing in the history of civil authority had prepared anyone for this. Isaac moved through it the way he had moved through the Ishimura, methodically, efficiently, with the particular grim competence of a man who had done something very like this before and had the psychological scarring to prove it. Isaac made his way toward Dana, navigating the increasingly catastrophic state of the Sprawl. When he reached her, she gave him information. real information, things he hadn't known. She told him about the marker imprint, about what 3 years of proximity to marker-influenced research had done to his mind, about why EarthGov had kept him, and what they had been doing with the sessions they called treatment. The marker's signal, Dana explained, and it had encoded itself into Isaac's neural patterns. His mind had become, in a very real sense, a storage medium for marker data. EarthGov had been reading that data, extracting it, using it to advance their research program. But there was more. The imprint in Isaac's mind was also destabilizing. It was growing in the way a tumor grows, not with malice, but with the indifferent persistence of something following its own logic. Without intervention, it would eventually consume his cognitive function entirely. He would lose his mind, completely and irreversibly. Dana told him she could help, that she had a way to remove the imprint, to free him from what the marker had put in his head. Isaac, with nowhere else to turn and no better options visible, followed her guidance. And then, just as he reached her location, Dana was killed by EarthGov agents who had been tracking Isaac and had no interest in allowing him to be freed from the imprint they considered a valuable research asset. He was alone again, with new information, a more complete understanding of his situation, and no solution. The human antagonist of events on the Sprawl was a man named Hans Tiedemann, the director of EarthGov's marker research program on the station. Tiedemann was not a monster in any straightforward sense. He was a bureaucrat and a scientist with genuine conviction that the marker research was essential, that understanding this technology was a matter of civilizational survival for humanity. He had dedicated his career to it. He had made decisions that he justified as necessary sacrifices for a greater good. The outbreak on the Sprawl was, in a real sense, his creation, not through malice, but through the particular blindness of people who believe so completely in the importance of their work that they cannot see its costs until those costs are standing in front of them, wearing the faces of the dead. Tiedemann spent the events of Dead Space 2 trying to stop Isaac, trying to prevent him from destroying the marker, which Tiedemann still believed could be controlled, still believed could be made useful, even as everything around him demonstrated conclusively that it could not. He and Isaac would meet, eventually. The meeting did not go in Tiedemann's favor. Not everything on the Sprawl was darkness and death and institutional betrayal. Isaac also found an ally. Ellie Langford was a CEC pilot. Practical, tough, possessed of the particular survival instincts that deep space work tends to either develop or eliminate. She had been on the Sprawl when the outbreak began and had been surviving on her own, which was its own kind of testament to her capabilities. She and Isaac found each other in the chaos. The dynamic between them was not immediately warm. Ellie was focused on survival and escape. Isaac on the marker and on the solution to what was happening in his head. But they needed each other. And over the course of the Sprawl, something like trust developed between them. Ellie represented, for Isaac, a connection to ordinary human experience that the Ishimura had stripped from him. A reminder that people could be straightforward and reliable, that not everyone had a hidden agenda, that survival could be a shared goal rather than a lonely one. she would survive the sprawl. Their story did not end here. The marker's imprint in Isaac's mind manifested most intensely through Nicole. Throughout his time on the sprawl, Isaac continued to see her. Hallucinations, some subtle, some overwhelming. Nicole appearing in corridors, speaking to him, sometimes helping, sometimes saying things that were deeply disturbing. A presence simultaneously comforting and tormenting, because every vision of her was also a reminder of what had happened, of what the marker had done to her and done to him. The visions were not simply the product of grief. The marker was generating them deliberately, using the imprint in Isaac's neural architecture to reach into his most vulnerable memories and project them back at him. The Nicole he kept seeing was in some sense a message from the marker, or a symptom of its influence, or both simultaneously. Isaac had to learn again how to distinguish what was real from what the marker was showing him, how to function in the presence of something that was constantly reaching into his mind and pulling out the thing that hurt most. He managed, at enormous cost. By this point in the story, Isaac and we have accumulated enough information to begin understanding what the marker is actually trying to do. The necromorphs are not the goal. They are a means. The transformation of dead biological matter into necromorphs serves a specific purpose. It generates a particular kind of energy, a particular biological signal that feeds back into the marker and amplifies its broadcast. The more necromorphs, the stronger the signal. The stronger the signal, the more people are affected, and the more die, the more are transformed. A feedback loop, accelerating toward a specific threshold. That threshold is called convergence. Convergence is the end state the marker is working toward. A mass event in which the accumulated biological and energetic transformation reaches critical mass. The details of what happens at convergence are, even at this point in the story, not entirely clear. But what is clear is that it is not survivable by ordinary human beings, and that it appears to be connected to the purpose for which the markers were originally created. Who created the markers? Why? What is convergence meant to achieve? These questions are not fully answered yet. We are still in the middle of the story, but they are the questions that everything else is building toward. Isaac's path through the sprawl led him, eventually, to the marker itself, the red marker at the heart of EarthGov's research facility, the source of the signal that was consuming the station. Standing in its presence, Isaac experienced something that defied easy description. The imprint in his mind, the marker data encoded in his neural patterns, resonated with the marker itself. He could perceive things that others couldn't. He could understand, at some level below language, what the marker was doing and why. He also understood what he needed to do. The solution was not simply to destroy the marker. Destroying a marker physically did not neutralize its signal. The energy remained, dispersed but active. The solution was something more specific, more personal. Isaac had to use the imprint in his own mind to reach into the marker's signal and cancel it, to use the piece of the marker that lived in his head against the marker itself. This was an extraordinarily dangerous process. Using the imprint meant engaging with the marker's signal directly, consciously, while maintaining enough of his own identity to direct it, rather than being consumed by it. It meant standing in the presence of something that had already nearly destroyed him once, and choosing to go deeper into it. He did it. He stood in the marker's presence, in the heart of the Sprawl's research facility, surrounded by everything the outbreak had made of the station, and he reached into the signal and he found the off switch. The marker was destroyed. Its signal collapsed. The Necromorphs, deprived of the signal driving them, lost their coordination and became something that could be contained. The destruction of the marker did not save the Sprawl. The station had taken too much damage. The structural integrity had been compromised in too many sections. What the Necromorphs hadn't destroyed, the emergency responses to them had. Bulkheads blown, sections vented, systems failed. The Sprawl was dying, and dying stations are not survivable by people who stay in them. Isaac and Ellie reached an evacuation point. There was a ship, barely functional enough to get them out. They got on it. The Sprawl collapsed behind them as they pulled away. A cascade of structural failures that consumed hundreds of thousands of tons of metal and everything still inside it. Isaac Clarke and Ellie Langford escaped, both alive, both damaged in ways that didn't show immediately, both carrying the weight of what the Sprawl had been and what it had become. In the aftermath, adrift, the immediate crisis over, and the enormity of everything just beginning to be felt, Isaac allowed himself something he hadn't been able to afford while it was happening. He allowed himself to rest. The Sprawl was gone. The Ishimura was still drifting, dark and dangerous, in the vicinity of Aegis VII. The original black marker, the one from the moon, was still somewhere in EarthGov's hands. EarthGov itself was shaken. The loss of the Sprawl, the scale of it, the number of people dead, could not be hidden entirely. Questions were being asked that powerful institutions did not want to answer. The marker research program officially was in a state of emergency reassessment, and unofficially, the people who had driven it were not prepared to stop. The potential of the technology was too great in their estimation. The disasters were setbacks, not conclusions. And somewhere in the wider galaxy, beyond the borders of human space as humanity currently understood them, something else was stirring. The markers had been broadcasting, for a long time, towards something, and that something had been listening. In the next part, we travel to a frozen planet called Tau Volantis, where Isaac Clarke, still not done, still not free, will finally begin to understand the full scope of what the markers have always been working toward, and where the oldest secret in the story will finally be uncovered. Rest now. The cold is coming, but it is not here yet. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. Let the tension leave your shoulders. We have followed Isaac Clarke through 2 catastrophes now, through the dead corridors of the Ishimura and the burning chaos of the Sprawl, through loss and betrayal and the particular psychological violence of a weapon that uses your own memories against you. He survived both. He escaped both. And for a brief time, he was free. This part of the story is about what happened when that freedom ended, about the frozen planet at the edge of known space, where the oldest question in the Dead Space universe finally received its answer, about what the markers were always building toward. In the time between Dead Space 2 and Dead Space 3, Isaac Clarke was living as quietly as a man with his history could manage. He and Ellie had gotten out together, but the weight of what they had been through, the Ishimura, the Sprawl, the accumulated damage of years spent in proximity to the marker's influence, was not weight that two people could share evenly forever. Relationships built in crisis do not always survive the absence of it. Ellie and Isaac had separated. She had moved on, in the way that people with her particular kind of resilience sometimes can. She had found a purpose, research, exploration, the search for answers about the markers and what they were. She had gone looking for something specific, a place called Tau Volantis, which appeared in fragments of marker data and classified EarthGov records as a location of extraordinary significance. Isaac had stayed behind. He was living in a small habitation on a civilian station, keeping a low profile and trying to rebuild something like an ordinary life. He was not entirely succeeding. The marker imprint was still with him, quieter now, without an active marker nearby to resonate with it, but present. A low hum at the back of everything, a slight wrongness in the texture of reality that he had learned to live alongside but would never fully be free of. He was not happy, but he was alive and he was functional, and some days that felt like enough. By the time of Dead Space 3, Unitology had transformed into something its early founders would not have recognized. In the years since the Ishimura and the Sprawl, the broader political situation had deteriorated significantly. EarthGov, already weakened by the disasters associated with its marker research program, already struggling with the questions that the Sprawl's destruction had raised, had come under increasing pressure from multiple directions, and Unitology had been growing in membership, growing in resources, and growing in something new and alarming: military capability. The Church of Unitology had always had security forces, private guards for its facilities and personnel, but in the years leading up to Dead Space 3, under the leadership of a man named Jacob Danik, those security forces had been transformed into something much more serious. Danik was a true believer of a particular kind, intelligent, charismatic, absolutely certain in his convictions, and convinced that the moment of unity, the marker's promise, the transformation that Unitology had been built around, was at hand. That EarthGov's interference, its attempts to control and study the markers rather than embrace them, had been the only thing delaying humanity's transcendence. He wanted to remove that interference. He wanted to release the markers, all of them, everywhere, and allow convergence to occur. In his mind, this was not mass death. It was mass salvation. He had the soldiers to pursue this goal, and he had intelligence about where the most significant marker-related site in known space was located: Tau Volantis. Tau Volantis was a planet far outside the well-traveled regions of human space. Cold, extraordinarily cold, locked in an artificial ice age that had nothing to do with its natural climate. Large, geologically strange in ways that preliminary survey data couldn't fully explain. And it had a history. 200 years before the events of Dead Space 3, our previous human expedition had reached Tau Volantis, a military and scientific mission, operating under extreme secrecy, had landed on the planet and discovered something that had permanently altered their understanding of everything. The records of that expedition had been classified at the highest possible level. The survivors, there were few of them, had spent the rest of their lives in conditions that were essentially imprisonment. to ensure that what they had found never reached the general public. What they had found was the origin point. Tau Volantis was where the markers had come from, not where they had been made, where the civilization that made them had existed, where the Necromorph transformation had first occurred, on a scale that dwarfed everything humanity had experienced on the Ishimura or the Sprawl, the species that had lived on Tau Volantis. The species that had created the markers was gone, had been gone for an extraordinarily long time. What remained of them were ruins, frozen under kilometers of ice, artifacts, records, and buried in the deep structure of the planet, the mechanism they had built in their final moments, a machine, a massive planet-spanning machine, built for a single purpose. Isaac was dragged back into all of this not by choice, but by the particular way that people with his history are never truly left alone. Unitologist soldiers, Danik's forces, arrived at his habitation. They were looking for him, and the reason was connected to Ellie. She had been on Tau Volantis. She had gone silent, and the last signal from her expedition pointed toward Isaac as someone with the neural marker data that might be necessary for what needed to happen on that planet. Isaac went, partly because he was given very little choice, partly because Ellie was there, and whatever their relationship had become, she was still someone whose life mattered to him. The mission to Tau Volantis was itself a journey into conditions that tested the limits of human endurance even before the necromorphs were factored in. The planet was extraordinarily cold. The environment was hostile in multiple simultaneous ways, and Danik's forces were pursuing them every step of the journey, because Danik believed, correctly, as it turned out, that Isaac was heading toward the mechanism at the planet's core, and that his plans for that mechanism were directly opposed to Danik's own. As Isaac and his companions moved through the ruins of Tau Volantis, they began to piece together the story of the expedition that had come before. 2 centuries earlier, soldiers and scientists had landed on Tau Volantis and found the alien ruins. They had found the records of the species that had lived there, and they had found the markers, not copies, not replicas, but original markers, ancient beyond measurement, the source material from which all subsequent red markers had been derived. The soldiers from that earlier expedition had faced the same catastrophe that Isaac had faced on the Ishimura. The necromorphs, the signal, the transformation of the dead. They had fought and died and been transformed in their turn. Their remains still present in the ice of Tau Volantis 200 years later. But some of them had survived long enough to understand what the alien species had discovered about the markers, and what they had tried to do about it. The alien species, referred to in research materials as the Tau Volantis aliens, though they had their own name for themselves that human linguists had never fully translated, had created the markers. This was their technology, their achievement, their terrible mistake. They had created the markers as a kind of beacon, a signal directed outward into the depths of space, towards something that was already out there, something enormous, something that the markers were designed to call home. This is the revelation at the center of everything, the answer to the question that the entire Dead Space universe has been building toward. The Brethren moons. In the deepest reaches of space, Beyond the navigable regions of human territory, there exist entities that defy easy categorization. They are vast, moon-sized, as the name suggests, bodies of transformed biological matter on a scale that makes every necromorph outbreak in human experience look like a preliminary sketch. They are the end state of convergence, the final form of the transformation process that the markers initiate and the necromorphs accelerate toward. When a convergence event reaches its threshold, when enough biological matter has been transformed, when the signal reaches sufficient intensity, the accumulated mass does not simply stay where it is. It coalesces. It organizes. It becomes something new, something that moves through space, something very old, something that has been doing this for an incomprehensible span of time, traveling between star systems, finding planets with life, triggering the marker signal, waiting for convergence, absorbing the result, and moving on. The Brethren moons are, in the most precise sense, made from the dead of 1,000 civilizations. Every species that ever encountered a marker and was consumed by its process contributed to their mass. The aliens of Tau Volantis were among them. The species before them, and the species before that, going back further than human mathematics can comfortably reach. The markers are not tools of these civilizations. They are not gifts or tests or messages in any positive sense. The markers are lures, bait, a mechanism by which the Brethren moons seed new worlds, and trigger the transformation process, and harvest the result. Every marker that humanity has found, every red marker that EarthGov built, every outbreak on every ship and station and colony, all of it has been the Brethren moons feeding. The species on Tau Volantis understood this, eventually. Too late to save themselves, but not too late to attempt a response. In their final years, as the convergence process consumed their civilization, a group of survivors built something, a machine of extraordinary complexity, using technology that human scientists would spend decades trying to fully understand, designed to do one specific thing: stop the signal. The machine on Tau Volantis was built to generate a counter-signal, a transmission powerful enough to suppress the marker broadcast on a planetary scale, and to interrupt the convergence process at the moment of its triggering. If it worked, it would prevent the Brethren moons from being called. It would break the cycle that had consumed civilization after civilization for eons. It had worked, in a limited sense. The convergence on Tau Volantis had been halted, frozen, quite literally, in the moment of its occurring, which explained the artificial ice age that had locked the planet in place for 200 years. But the machine had not been fully activated. The survivors had not had time to complete it before the last of them died, and so Tau Volantis had remained in a state of suspension. The convergence frozen, the machine incomplete, the planet waiting. Isaac's goal on Tau Volantis was to complete the machine, to fully activate it, to permanently suppress the marker signal, and to end the cycle. Danek's goal was the opposite. He wanted to destroy the machine, to remove the one thing standing between humanity and what he believed would be its transcendence. In Danek's mind, the machine was not a salvation device, but an obstacle. The Brethren moons were not predators but gods, and convergence was not death but apotheosis. This was the fundamental conflict of Dead Space 3. Two men with completely incompatible understandings of what the markers were and what the future should look like, fighting for control of a machine on a frozen planet at the edge of the known. Danik was not stupid. He was not irrational given his premises. If you genuinely believe that the transformation of biological matter into something vast and unified is the fulfillment of existence rather than its destruction, and then the machine on Tau Volantis really is the enemy. The tragedy of Danik is that his premises were wrong in a way that his experience gave him no means to recognize. He had never seen a brethren moon. He had never encountered convergence at full scale. His faith was constructed from doctrine and conviction, and the marker's signal, which had been working on him for years, shaping his perceptions in ways he believed were spiritual clarity and were something quite different. Isaac reached the machine. He fought through Tau Volantis, through Danik's soldiers and the Necromorphs and the alien creatures that the frozen planet had preserved from the original extinction, and he reached the device at the planet's core. He activated it. The process required things of him that drew on the marker imprint still present in his neural architecture. A final use of the thing that had been inside him since the Ishimura turned one last time towards stopping the signal that had put it there. The machine activated. The counter signal began to broadcast. Danik died in the events surrounding the machine's activation, not killed by Isaac directly, but consumed by a Necromorph convergence event in the moments before the machine suppressed it. And then came the moment that was not the victory it appeared to be, because the brethren moons were already moving. The machine's activation had suppressed the marker signal on Tau Volantis, had broken the local convergence event, but the brethren moons had already received the signal. They had already been in transit, moving through the deep spaces between stars toward human territory. The machine had interrupted the meal, but the guests were already at the door. In the final moments of Dead Space 3, enormous shadows appeared in the sky above Tau Volantis, moon-sized shapes moving, ancient and vast and utterly indifferent. The brethren moons had arrived. Dead Space 3's ending is one of the most genuinely bleak in gaming history, and it earns that bleakness. Isaac Clarke, who had survived the Ishimura and the Sprawl, and now Tau Volantis, who had destroyed markers and hive minds and dealt with every catastrophe that the marker's influence could place in his path. Isaac Clarke looked up at the brethren moons descending on Tau Volantis and understood that this was not something he could fight. Not with engineering tools, not with improvised weapons, and not with stubbornness and grief and the refusal to lie down. The DLC ending, the canonical conclusion, shows Isaac and Ellie separated. The machine's activation had bought time but not victory. The brethren moons were present. The scale of what humanity was facing had finally been made undeniable. There was no clean resolution. There was survival, fragile and uncertain. There was the knowledge of what was out there, which was its own kind of burden. And there was the question, hanging in the air above a frozen planet, of whether the machine would be enough, whether the counter signal could ultimately hold against entities that had been doing this since before human history began. The games do not answer this question. The story of Isaac Clarke ends here, in narrative terms, in a place of profound uncertainty, but the universe of Dead Space is larger than Isaac Clarke. And there are pieces of the story that happen beyond his immediate experience, comics, films, other games, that fill in parts of what we have only touched on. In the next part, we go back and fill in those gaps. The Dead Space comics, the animated film Downfall, the events of Dead Space Extraction, the story of what happened in places Isaac never visited, told by people who didn't survive to tell it. Close your eyes. The moons are far away from here. You are safe. Rest now. Welcome back. Settle in. Let everything slow down. The three main games tell Isaac Clarke's story, but the universe of Dead Space is much larger than any one man's experience of it. There are events that happened before Isaac arrived on the Ishimura. There are people who lived and died in the same catastrophe he survived, whose stories he never knew. There are corners of this world that the games only gesture toward. This part fills in those spaces. We are going to slow down, step sideways from the main timeline, and spend some time with the stories that exist alongside it. These are quieter stories in some ways, more intimate. The scale is smaller. Not a man fighting to save civilization, but individuals caught in something they didn't choose and couldn't escape. There is something particularly affecting about that kind of story, and the weight of it comes not from the cosmic scale of the markers and the brethren moons, but from the human scale of the people in its path. Let us begin with Downfall, an animated film released alongside the first Dead Space game, telling the story of what happened on the Ishimura in the hours and days before Isaac Clarke arrived. If the first game is Isaac's experience of the aftermath, Downfall is the experience of the catastrophe as it happened. The distinction matters. When Isaac explores the Ishimura, it is already silent. The horror is in the evidence of what occurred. In Downfall, we watch it occur. The central character is Alyssa Vincent, the chief of security aboard the Ishimura, a capable woman in a role that was never meant to deal with anything like what was coming, are doing her best to maintain order in a situation that had moved completely beyond the capacity of any security protocols to address. Vincent is a practical person, not ideological, not particularly philosophical. She has a job, she takes it seriously. She cares about the people under her authority and the people she is responsible for protecting. These qualities, which would serve her well in any ordinary crisis, are precisely the qualities that make what happens to her so difficult to watch. The film begins with the marker already aboard the Ishimura. The extraction from Aegis VII has happened, just as we described in earlier parts. The marker is in its containment area. The crew is going about their work, largely unaware of the specific nature of what has been brought on board, unaware only that something important is happening in the restricted sections of the ship. The first signs are the ones we have come to recognize: the unusual behavior, the vivid dreams, the conflicts that escalate faster than they should. Vincent begins receiving reports of incidents that don't fit any normal category of shipboard problem. She investigates, she escalates, she runs directly into the wall of classification and restricted access that EarthGov's involvement in the marker retrieval has erected around the relevant information. She is trying to solve a problem she has not been given the information to understand. Downfall covers the period from the marker's arrival on the ship to the point where the outbreak is fully established. and containment has failed completely. It is a story told in hours rather than days. The speed of the collapse is one of the most disturbing things about it. People who are introduced as functional ordinary crew members, engineers, medical staff, security officers, are dead or transformed within a span of time that allows almost no adjustment. There is no period of gradual escalation during which the people on the ship could plausibly have done something different and survived. The transformation from normal operations to catastrophe happens faster than human institutional response can adapt. Vincent fights. She is very good at fighting in the context of what she knows. She is a trained security professional dealing with what appears to be a shipboard emergency. But the tools of shipboard security are not adequate for what she is facing, and she recognizes this faster than most, which gives her a brief and terrible window of clear-eyed understanding of just how bad the situation is. She makes decisions that are brutal and necessary. She sacrifices people she cares about to protect others. She follows the logic of crisis management, even when that logic leads to outcomes that would be unconscionable under any other circumstances. She does not survive. Almost no one does. But the film treats her death with the kind of weight it deserves, not as a dramatic punctuation mark, but as the quiet, terrible conclusion of a story about a person who did everything right and was destroyed anyway. Downfall is a difficult watch. It is also, among the expanded Dead Space materials, one of the finest pieces of storytelling in the universe. It earns its tragedy. Extraction is a prequel game that covers a slightly different slice of the same period. Specifically, the events on the Aegis VII colony in the days before and during the marker's extraction. Where Downfall focuses on the Ishimura, Extraction focuses on the colony, on the people who lived there, who worked there, who had built lives in that isolated place, and who found themselves at ground zero of the first Necromorph outbreak. The central characters are a small group of survivors, a mix of colonists and military personnel, who are trying to get off the colony and reach the Ishimura before everything falls apart completely. What they don't know, as they fight their way toward the ship they believe represents safety, is what is already happening aboard it. Extraction fills in the texture of what colony life actually looked like before the collapse. The characters have histories with each other, small dramas and relationships that exist outside the immediate crisis. There is a man named Gabe Weller, a military security officer whose practicality and competence are familiar in the way that Alyssa Vincent's are. The kind of person who is very good at the normal version of their job and has to adapt quickly and imperfectly to a version of reality that the normal job never prepared them for. There is Lexine Murdoch, a colonist who turns out to have an unusual relationship with the marker's signal. She is, for reasons that the game explores, relatively resistant to its psychological effects. Not immune, not unaffected, but able to function in proximity to the marker in ways that others cannot. This quality makes her extraordinarily valuable to the people around her, and it also makes her a target, because EarthGov's interest in marker-resistant individuals is, as we have established, not a benign kind of interest. Extraction's picture of the Aegis VII colony in its final hours is one of the most detailed portraits of Necromorph outbreak dynamics in the entire Dead Space universe. We see how the transformation spread through the population, not uniformly, not all at once, but in clusters and waves determined by proximity to the marker's signal, by individual psychological susceptibility, by the random factors of who happened to die, where and when. Some sections of the colony collapse immediately. Others hold together for hours longer, and small pockets of order surrounded by spreading chaos. The Unitologist population of the colony, as we mentioned in earlier parts, behaves in ways that the non-Unitologist survivors find incomprehensible. They are not running. They are not fighting. Some of them are actively preventing others from escaping, not out of cruelty, but out of a genuine conviction that what is happening is sacred and that interfering with it is a kind of blasphemy. The confrontation between the Unitologist colonists and the survivors who simply want to get out is one of the most human and most heartbreaking elements of Extraction's story. These are not abstract enemies. These are people who have been living alongside each other, who know each other's names, whose children have played together, whose deaths carry individual weight rather than statistical weight. The survivors eventually reach the Ishimura. And Extraction's ending, placed against the beginning of Downfall and the first Dead Space game, completes a circle that is profoundly dark. These people who fought so hard to reach the ship believed they were reaching safety, and we, watching from the outside, know exactly what was waiting for them. The Dead Space comics, published by Anthony Johnston and illustrated by Ben Templesmith, add significant depth to the period immediately surrounding the first game's events. The primary comic series, simply titled Dead Space, focuses on a man named Elias Feed, a journalist who becomes aware that something is deeply wrong on Aegis VII and begins investigating. His investigation brings him into contact with Unitology's internal workings, with EarthGov's classified programs, and with the broader political machinery that has been surrounding the marker situation for years. Elias is a very different kind of protagonist from Isaac Clarke. He is not a survivor in a physical crisis. He is an investigator trying to understand a conspiracy, and his story operates at the level of institutions and information rather than the level of moment-to-moment survival. Through his eyes, we see the Dead Space universe from a perspective that is removed from the immediate horror, which paradoxically makes certain aspects of it more unsettling rather than less. The horror from a distance, understood as a systemic failure with identifiable human causes, is a different kind of horror than the horror of being in the corridor with the Necromorphs. The comics detail the specific chain of decisions that led to the Aegis VII operation, the meetings, the memos, the cost-benefit calculations in which human lives appear as line items, the way that large institutions, EarthGov, CEC, Unitology, interact and conflict and occasionally align around the marker situation, each with their own agenda, none of them fully understanding what they are dealing with. It is institutional horror, which is, in some ways, the most realistic kind. A second comic series, Dead Space, Liberation, bridges the events of Dead Space 2 and Dead Space 3. It focuses on John Carver, a soldier who becomes Isaac's companion in the third game, and provides the backstory that explains who he is and why he is the way he is when we meet him. Carver is, in some ways, a mirror of Isaac. Both are men who have lost someone because of the markers. Both carry that loss in ways that shape everything they do. But where Isaac's loss has made him somewhat withdrawn, somewhat oriented inward, Carver's has made him aggressive and focused outward. A man who processes grief through action rather than endurance. His wife and son were killed in the events connected to the marker research program. He was not there when it happened. That absence, the inability to have done anything, the pure randomness of being elsewhere when the people you love needed you most, is a wound that doesn't close. Liberation follows Carver as he begins to understand the scope of what Unitology is planning, what Danik's forces are preparing, and how the Tau Volantis situation connects to everything else. And it is a story about a man who is very good at violence finding a purpose for that capability that feels, for the first time in a while, like it might actually matter. It also develops Carver's particular relationship with the marker imprint. He, like Isaac, has been exposed to marker influence in ways that have left marks. His hallucinations are different from Isaac's. Less about a specific lost person, more about guilt and culpability. The marker finds different doors into different minds, and what it finds behind Carver's door is an architecture of self-recrimination, that it works with considerable effectiveness. The film Aftermath fills in what happened in the period between the first and second games. Specifically, what happened on a ship called the USG Ishimura, which had been dispatched to Aegis VII after the Ishimura went dark. The O'Bannon's mission was official but classified, to assess the situation at Aegis VII, to retrieve whatever could be retrieved, and to report back to EarthGov. It is, in the context of Dead Space, almost a template for bad outcomes. A ship sent into a dangerous situation by people who don't fully understand the danger, with insufficient preparation and insufficient information. Aftermath is structured as a series of testimonies. 4 survivors of the O'Bannon mission, each telling their version of what happened from a different perspective. This structure is unusual for Dead Space media, and it creates something interesting. 4 accounts of the same events that differ in their details and interpretations, and that reveal character through the specific ways each person chooses to remember and present what they experienced. The ship's encounter with the Necromorphs follows the now familiar pattern of escalating crisis, failed containment, desperate survival. What distinguishes Aftermath is less the mechanics of the outbreak and more the human dynamics, how a small group of people under extreme pressure relate to each other, how they make decisions, how they apportion blame and responsibility. One of the survivors has information that EarthGov wants. The process by which EarthGov extracts that information and what they do with it connects directly to the events of Dead Space 2 and the Sprawl's marker research program. Everything feeds into everything else. The Dead Space universe is remarkably coherent in this way. The comics and films are not simply additional content layered on top of the games, but genuine parts of a single continuous story, each illuminating something that the others only implied. Before we close this part, it is worth sitting for a moment with the full weight of what the Dead Space universe's expanded lore reveals about the scale of what humanity faced. The Brethren moons are not a threat that was created by human activity. They predate humanity by an incalculable span of time. The civilization that lived on Tau Volantis, which was itself ancient and advanced beyond anything human technology had achieved, was already dealing with a marker situation that implied the moons had been active for far longer than that civilization's history. And this means that the process we have been watching, the markers, the outbreaks, convergence, the moons, has been playing out on planet after planet, civilization after civilization, for longer than any human framework can meaningfully represent. Every inhabited world that the markers ever reached, every species that ever felt that initial signal and found it inexplicably soothing, every civilization that built its religion around the message in the stone and never understood that the message was not meant for them, it was meant to prepare them. Dead Space is, among other things, a story about scale, about the particular terror of discovering that what you thought was a local catastrophe is actually a feature of the universe itself, and that the forces arrayed against you have been arrayed against everyone who came before you, and will be arrayed against everyone who comes after, and that the best you can do is the same thing the Tau Volantis civilization did. Understand it, build something against it, and hope that what you built is enough. Whether it was enough, whether Isaac's activation of the machine on Tau Volantis bent the arc of this ancient story towards something different, is the question that hangs over everything. In the next part, we return to the games themselves and look at what the Dead Space remake revealed and changed. How the original story was retold for a new generation, what was preserved, what was deepened, and what the remake added to our understanding of Isaac Clarke and the world he moved through. Rest now. The expanded universe is large and strange and dark, but you have seen its shape now. And knowing the shape of a dark thing is always better than not knowing. Sleep well. Welcome back. You are almost at the end of this story now. Take a breath. Let your body settle. We have traveled a long way together. From the resource-depleted Earth of the 22nd century, through the birth of Unitology, through the horrors of the Ishimura, and the Sprawl and Tau Volantis, through the expanded corners of the universe where the comics and films live. We have followed Isaac Clarke from an ordinary engineer on a maintenance vessel to a man who has seen the oldest predator in the galaxy and somehow is still alive. This part is different from the ones before it. We are not moving forward in the timeline. We are going back to the beginning, to the Ishimura, to the first game. But we are going back with new eyes. In 2023, Motive Studio released the Dead Space remake, a full reconstruction of the original 2008 game, rebuilt from the ground up on a new engine, with updated visuals and audio and, most significantly, a new version of Isaac Clarke. The story is the same story. The ship is the same ship. The horrors are the same horrors, more or less. But the experience of it, and what it tells us about the characters inside it, is meaningfully different. Different enough to spend a full chapter on. The most fundamental change in the Dead Space remake is that Isaac Clarke speaks. In the original 2008 game, Isaac was a silent protagonist. He moved through the Ishimura without dialogue, without verbal reactions to what he was experiencing, without the kind of voiced interiority that most players expect from a central character in a story-driven game, and his silence was a design choice, one that had its own kind of effectiveness, allowing the player to project themselves into Isaac's position. But it also meant that Isaac as a character was defined almost entirely by what happened around him, rather than by who he was. The remake gives Isaac a voice. More than that, it gives him a presence, a personality, a history that exists outside the immediate events of the Ishimura. The voice performance by actor Gunnar Wright, who had voiced Isaac in the second and third games, brings something to the character that retrospectively enriches the entire trilogy. Isaac is not simply a man moving through horror. He is a specific man, someone with a dry, quiet humor that surfaces at unexpected moments, with a deep reservoir of competence and an equally deep reservoir of grief, are with the particular emotional flatness of a person who has trained themselves to function under pressure by not allowing themselves to fully feel things until later. He talks to the survivors over the communication system. He talks to himself sometimes when the ship becomes overwhelming. He reacts to what he finds with the specific reactions of a person who knew some of the people whose remains he is encountering. He is not a blank slate. He is Isaac. The change that most significantly deepens the story of the remake is in Isaac's relationship with Nicole. In the original game, Nicole is primarily a presence felt through absence, through her final recorded message, through Isaac's pursuit of her through the ship, through the reveal of what happened to her. And the emotional weight of that relationship is established but not fully developed because Isaac never speaks about it. We understand that he loved her, that he is here because of her, that the revelation of her fate is the emotional culmination of his journey. But we experience this somewhat from the outside. The remake places Nicole more centrally in Isaac's interiority from the very beginning. He talks about her. He thinks about her out loud in the way that people do when they are trying to hold on to something precious in the middle of chaos. Small things. A reference to something she liked. A mention of something they had talked about before she left. Details that establish her as a real person in his life rather than a plot function. The remake also deepens the complexity of their relationship in ways that add texture to the original story. In the original, their relationship is presented as straightforwardly loving. He is here because he loves her, full stop. The remake suggests something more nuanced, that things between them had been complicated before she took the Ishimura posting. That his reason for being on the Kellyan is not simply love, but also unresolved things between them. Things he wanted to say, questions that had been left open, a relationship that was in a difficult place, and that he was not ready to accept might be over. This complication does not diminish the emotional power of the story. It deepens it, because it means that Isaac is not simply searching for Nicole. He is searching for a conversation, for the chance to say the things that hadn't been said. And the marker's cruelty in using Nicole's image against him becomes even more precise when we understand exactly what it is reaching into. The remake's technical achievements are considerable, but the one most relevant to the story is what the team at Motive did with the Ishimura itself. In the original game, the Ishimura is a series of contained environments connected by tram lines, each section accessible but essentially self-contained. A level-based structure that reflected the game design conventions of its time. You go to the engineering deck, you solve the engineering deck's problem, you move on. The ship is a sequence rather than a place. The remake rebuilds the Ishimura as a continuous, interconnected space. How you can walk from engineering to the medical bay to the crew quarters without a loading screen, following the actual physical layout of a ship, rather than moving between isolated levels. The Ishimura becomes somewhere you inhabit, rather than somewhere you pass through. This changes the experience of the story in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, but genuinely significant. When you can feel the physical relationship between different parts of the ship, when you understand that the medical bay is above the engineering section, that the crew quarters are a specific distance from the tram hub, that the observation deck looks out over the processing arm. The ship becomes real in a way that the original's level structure could not quite achieve. And the remake populates this continuous space with a density of environmental storytelling that the original could not have managed. Logs and messages and personal effects placed with care, telling small stories about the Ishimura's crew in the days before the outbreak. A birthday card left on a bunk, a half-finished meal in the cafeteria, the record of a card game interrupted mid-hand. These details accumulate into a portrait of the ship as a place where people lived, which makes the evidence of what happened to them carry a weight that purely mechanical horror cannot achieve. The Ishimura in the remake is a memorial as much as a horror setting. You are moving through the record of lives that ended badly and the care with which that record has been constructed. Ask you to acknowledge those lives rather than simply navigate past them. And the remake adds several new side quests and story elements that were not present in the original game. These additions serve multiple purposes. They flesh out the Ishimura's environment, they develop secondary characters, and in some cases, they connect to the broader Dead Space mythology in ways that the original did not. One of the most significant additions is a side quest involving a series of logs from a character who had been experimenting with the marker's signal in the period before the outbreak. An unofficial investigation into the psychological effects that the official research was not prepared to acknowledge. This narrative thread adds another layer to the picture of institutional failure that the Dead Space universe is built on. The evidence was there. People saw it, and the structures around them were not equipped to respond to it. The remake also adds a new sequence in which Isaac encounters evidence of something the original game only implied, that the marker had been conducting something like experiments on the Ishimura's crew, not simply transforming them, but doing something more specific with particular individuals. This connects to the broader remake's deepened interest in the marker as an active agent rather than simply a passive transmitter. The marker in the remake feels less like an object and more like a presence, not conscious in any human sense but purposeful, doing what it does with a consistency that implies intention, even if intention is not quite the right word for it. How the remake's ending diverges from the original in a way that sets up a potential sequel and recontextualizes certain elements of the experience, without detailing every specific moment for those who may wish to experience it themselves. The remake's conclusion involves Isaac discovering something that the original did not reveal in this way, something that changes the meaning of certain events throughout the game and positions the story for continuation in a direction that the original trilogy did not take. The nature of this change suggests that a potential remake sequel would not simply retell the events of Dead Space 2, but would chart a new course. One that takes the characters and the established mythology and moves them somewhere that hasn't been explored before. This is an interesting creative choice. The original trilogy has a complete arc. Isaac Clarke's story, from the Ishimura to Tau Volantis, has a beginning and a middle and an ending. Bleak and uncertain as that ending is. A remake continuity that branches away from the original timeline could explore the universe without being constrained by the need to reach the same destination. What that new destination might look like, what new horrors, what new revelations, what new corners of the Dead Space universe, remains, at the time of this telling, unknown. Stepping back from the specific additions and changes, the Dead Space remake's most significant contribution to the mythology is something more diffuse. It is a demonstration that the original story was built on a foundation solid enough to sustain a deepening. The original Dead Space was, in many ways, a masterpiece of atmosphere and mechanical design that was somewhat less developed in its characterization and emotional storytelling. It knew what it wanted to make the player feel, and it was extraordinarily effective at making them feel it. But Isaac, in his silence, was more a vessel for that feeling than a person experiencing it. The remake reveals that there was a person there all along, that the story of Isaac Clarke on the Ishimura is not just a survival horror experience, but a human story. About grief, about unfinished business, about the particular desperation of someone trying to reach a person they love in a place where love is exactly the thing being weaponized against them. This does not change what happened. The events are the same. The Ishimura is the same ship. The Necromorphs are the same creatures. The marker is the same presence. But the remake surrounds those events with enough humanity that they hit differently. The horror is the same. The grief is deeper, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about the Dead Space universe as a whole. The horror is always the same. It is cosmic, ancient, indifferent, overwhelming. What changes from story to story and character to character is the grief, the specific, individual, irreducible grief of the people caught in its path. Isaac Clarke's grief is the heart of the story. The remake understood this better than the original did and rebuilt accordingly. As of this telling, the Dead Space universe exists in an interesting state of suspension. The original trilogy is complete, a full arc, bleak in its conclusion, and that told one man's journey from ordinary engineer to the person who activated the machine that may have saved the species, or may have only delayed its end. The expanded materials, comics, films, supplementary games, have fleshed out that universe into something genuinely rich and internally consistent. The remake has reopened the story's possibility space, suggesting a new direction while honoring everything that came before. Whether that new direction will be pursued, whether the remake will receive the sequel that its ending implies, is not something that can be answered here. These things exist in the particular uncertainty of creative industries, where the relationship between artistic intention and commercial reality is never fully predictable. What can be said is that the Dead Space universe is a significant achievement. It built a mythology of genuine depth and coherence around a genre, survival horror in space, that could easily have remained at the level of pure sensation. It asked serious questions about institutional corruption, about the limits of human ambition, about the particular vulnerability of belief systems to the things they claim to transcend. And it grounded all of that in one specific human being, moving through the dark with inadequate tools and an enormous amount of stubborn, grieving will. In the final part of this journey, we take one last look at everything. The full scope of the timeline from the first marker's discovery to the Brethren moons arriving at Tau Volantis, all laid out in sequence. A final overview, a resting place for everything we have covered. We are almost at the end. You have come a long way. Sleep well. Welcome back. This is the last part. Take a moment with that. You have been on a long journey through a very dark universe, and you are almost at the end of it. Whatever you came here for, the story, the atmosphere, the particular comfort of a voice in the dark talking about something that is not your own life, you have nearly reached the far shore of it. This final part does something different from the ones before it. We are not going to push forward into new material. Instead, we are going to do what you do at the end of a long journey. Turn around, look back at the road, and see it whole. The full Dead Space timeline, laid out from beginning to end. Every major event, every turn, every revelation, placed in sequence, so that the shape of the whole thing becomes visible. And then, at the very end, in some thoughts about what this universe is actually about, what it was trying to say, why a story this dark resonates the way it does. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. We are going to take this gently. The story of Dead Space does not begin with humanity. It begins with the Brethren moons, entities so ancient that the word ancient fails to capture it. Moon-sized masses of transformed biological matter moving through the universe on a cycle that predates every civilization humanity has ever discovered evidence of. The Brethren moons travel. They find worlds with life. They seed those worlds with markers. Transmitters designed to broadcast a signal that affects living nervous systems and reanimates dead tissue. They wait. The signal works on the population of the world. The dead begin to transform. The living, unaffected by the signal, become increasingly susceptible to the transformation themselves. Eventually, the accumulated transformation reaches critical mass, convergence, and the biological matter of an entire world coalesces into a new moon, which joins the others and continues the cycle. This has happened an uncountable number of times before any human being ever existed. The species on Tau Volantis, ancient, technologically sophisticated, gone long before humanity reached space, were one of the civilizations that encountered this cycle. They created the markers themselves as part of the convergence process that consumed their world. But a group of survivors understood what was happening in time to attempt a response. They built a machine designed to suppress the marker signal and interrupt convergence. They did not finish it before the last of them died. Their world froze, convergence suspended mid-event, waiting. This is the deep past. everything else is downstream from it, moving forward by an enormous span of time to the 22nd century, to a humanity that has spread across the solar system and is running out of the resources it needs to sustain its civilization. The Concordance Extraction Corporation develops Planetcracking, the technology that dismantles planets for the raw materials inside them. This technology, and the fleet of ships built to use it, becomes the lifeline that keeps human civilization functional. CEC builds the USG Ishimura, the first and greatest of the planet crackers, in 2446. In 2214, a research mission on the Moon discovers the Black Marker, an alien object emitting a signal that affects human psychology. The government classifies the discovery immediately. Dr. Michael Altman studies the marker and publishes his findings publicly in the 2019 S. He is killed shortly after. His writings become the foundation of a new religion. The Church of Unitology is born from Altman's work. Built around the belief that the marker holds the key to human transcendence, that death is transformation rather than ending, that the signal is a divine gift. EarthGov begins the Red Marker project, attempting to construct artificial markers based on the blueprint encoded in the Black Marker's structure. The project is classified at the highest level. The red markers reproduce the signal of the original, including all of its effects on human biology and psychology. The Kellion crashes during docking. The crew is killed or scattered. Isaac is alone on the Ishimura. Over the following hours, Isaac moves through the ship. Engineering bays, medical decks, research labs, crew quarters, mining platforms, the surface of Aegis VII itself. He encounters the Necromorphs. He adapts. He survives. He is guided by the voices of 3 survivors: Zach Hammond, the Kellion's executive officer; Kendra Daniels, a computer specialist; and Dr. Kine, who tells him that the marker must be returned to the planet's surface. He discovers the truth about Nicole, that she did not survive the outbreak, that the visions of her he has been experiencing throughout his time on the ship are projections generated by the marker's signal, using his grief and his memories as raw material. Kendra Daniels reveals herself as an EarthGov agent. Her mission was never to help Isaac, but to retrieve the marker for EarthGov's research program. She takes the marker and escapes. Isaac follows. On the surface of Aegis VII, in the ruins of the colony, Isaac confronts the hive mind, a massive convergence organism assembled from the colony's dead, the culmination of what the marker had been building toward on this planet. He destroys it. Kendra is killed by a surviving Necromorph. The marker is returned to the surface. Isaac escapes. He is rescued. He is taken to a medical facility on the Sprawl, a massive civilian station orbiting Saturn. 3 years pass. Isaac is held in EarthGov's custody on the Sprawl, officially for treatment, and actually for the marker imprint encoded in his neural architecture, which EarthGov has been using as a research tool. EarthGov has been running a new marker research program on the Sprawl. A red marker, constructed there, has been active for months. The population is affected. The outbreak begins. Isaac wakes in a straitjacket, with no clear memory of the 3 years. A woman named Dana Le Guin helps him escape and tells him the truth about the imprint, that it is growing, that without intervention, it will destroy his cognitive function completely. She is killed by EarthGov agents before she can help him. Isaac moves through the sprawl. He finds Ellie Langford, a CEC pilot, practical and capable, who becomes his ally and companion. He confronts director Hans Tiedemann, who runs EarthGov's marker program and believes the technology can still be controlled. He experiences constant visions of Nicole, the marker's imprint projecting her image into his perception, reaching into the same grief it used on the Ishimura and pressing again. Isaac uses the marker imprint in his own mind against the Sprawl's marker, engaging with the signal directly, using the piece of the marker living in his neural architecture to find and collapse the signal from within. The marker is destroyed. The Sprawl is too damaged to survive. Isaac and Ellie escape as the station collapses behind them. Both alive, neither whole. Some time after the Sprawl, Isaac and Ellie have separated. Ellie has been following leads on Tau Volantis, a remote, frozen planet that appears in classified marker research data as a location of extraordinary significance. Jacob Danik, the leader of Unitology's military wing, has been building toward a specific goal: destroying the machine on Tau Volantis that the alien civilization built to suppress the marker signal. Danik believes that machine is all that stands between humanity and its transcendence. He wants it gone. Unitologist soldiers arrive at Isaac's habitation and force him into the mission to Tau Volantis, where Ellie's expedition has gone silent. On Tau Volantis, Isaac and his companions, including Sergeant John Carver, whose wife and son were killed by marker-related events, pieced together the history of the alien civilization from the ruins buried in the ice. They understand what the machine does. They understand what the Brethren moons are. They understand the full scope of what the markers have always been. Danik pursues them throughout, determined to destroy the machine. He dies in the events surrounding Isaac's activation of it, consumed by a convergence event in the machine's final moments. Isaac activates the machine. The counter-signal broadcasts. The convergence on Tau Volantis is suppressed. The Brethren moons arrive anyway. They had already been called. The machine interrupted the meal, but the guests were already at the door. The ending is what it is. Survival, fragile and uncertain, under the shadow of something that has been devouring civilizations since before human history began. In 2023, the Dead Space remake retells the events of the first game, with Clarke as a speaking character, the Ishimura as a continuous and fully interconnected space, and additional story content that deepens the mythology. The remake's ending diverges from the original, suggesting a new timeline, a new direction for the story, potential futures that the original trilogy did not explore. Whether those futures will be explored, what form they will take, what new corners of this universe will be opened. This is a question that belongs to a future this telling cannot see. The timeline ends here in a state of suspension. Clarke somewhere, the Brethren moon somewhere, the machine on Tau Volantis, broadcasting its counter-signal into the dark, the markers scattered across the galaxy, waiting, and humanity, going on as it always has, knowing more than it did, not knowing nearly enough, doing what it can with what it has. We have reached the end of the timeline, but before we close, it is worth spending a few quiet minutes on what the Dead Space universe is actually trying to say, because it is trying to say something. Universes built with this much care always are. Dead Space is, on its surface, a horror story. Monsters in dark corridors, a terrifying environment, the sustained pressure of threat and survival. It does all of that extraordinarily well. But the horror is in service of something. The first thing Dead Space is about is institutional failure. Every catastrophe in this universe, the Ishimura, the Sprawl, Aegis VII, the Red Marker program, was preventable. Not in the sense that someone could have stopped the Brethren moons, but in the sense that the specific human decisions that led to each disaster were made by identifiable people with knowable motivations, and at almost every step there was a moment where a different choice was possible. EarthGov classified the evidence. CEC prioritized the operation over the warning signs. Researchers continued experiments past the point where the evidence said stop. Institutional loyalty to the program, to the investment, to the belief that understanding the danger meant controlling it. These are not alien forces. They are the most human forces imaginable. The Dead Space universe is populated by people making bad decisions for recognizable reasons, and the horror is the consequence of those decisions at scale. The second thing Dead Space is about is the weaponization of belief. Unitology is the clearest example, but it is not the only one. EarthGov's researchers had their own form of belief. Belief in the value of the research. Belief in their own competence to handle what they were studying. Belief that the catastrophes they had seen were failures of implementation, rather than evidence that the project itself was wrong. These beliefs were as resistant to contrary evidence as any religious conviction. The Dead Space universe suggests that the human tendency to organize experience into belief systems, to find meaning, to construct frameworks that make the unbearable comprehensible, is exactly the vulnerability that the markers exploit. The marker's signal does not create beliefs from nothing. It works with what is already there. It finds the convictions people already hold and deepens them. The grief people already carry and intensifies it. The hope people already feel and redirects it. It is a mirror that reflects the inner life back at you, amplified and distorted, until you cannot distinguish your own genuine experience from what the marker has done to it. The third thing Dead Space is about is grief. Isaac Clarke's story is, at its core, a grief story. He is on the Ishimura because of Nicole. He keeps going because of Nicole. The marker reaches him most deeply through Nicole, and the resolution of his arc, to whatever extent it resolves, is not about defeating the cosmic horror, but about finding a way to carry the loss without being destroyed by it. The same is true of Carver, who carries the loss of his family, of the survivors in downfall and extraction and aftermath, each of whom is running toward someone or away from something that has already been lost. Of Altman, whose legacy was taken from him before he could shape it. Dead Space understands that grief is not a temporary state to be moved through on the way to recovery. It is something that becomes part of the structure of a person. It changes the landscape of the interior. And in a universe where a cosmic predator is specifically in the business of finding the most painful thing in your mind and pressing on it, grief is not just an emotion. It is a vulnerability. It is the door through which the darkness enters. And yet, Isaac Clarke is still alive at the end of the story. He survived the Ishimura and the Sprawl and Tau Volantis. He activated the machine. He did the thing under conditions that made it seem impossible, that at least gave humanity a chance. He did it grieving. He did it carrying Nicole with him through every corridor and every confrontation. He did not set the grief down in order to function. He functioned with it, alongside it, in spite of it, and sometimes because of it. That is the fourth thing Dead Space is about. The stubbornness of survival. The particular human quality of continuing to move when everything says stop. Not heroism in any clean sense. Isaac is not a hero in the way the word usually implies. He is a man who is very good at not dying, and who has a reason to keep trying that is more personal than ideological. He is an engineer who fixes broken things. The Ishimura is a broken thing. The Sprawl is a broken thing. The machine on Tau Volantis is a broken thing. In some sense, the entire situation is a broken thing. A universe with a predator in it that has been hunting the living since before memory. And Isaac Clarke, with his plasma cutter and his grief and his stubbornness, approaches all of it the way he approaches every broken system. Figure out what needs to happen, figure out how to make it happen, and keep going until it does. This is not a triumphant story. The universe of Dead Space does not resolve into safety or certainty. The Brethren moons are still out there. The markers are still scattered across the galaxy. The machine on Tau Volantis is broadcasting, but broadcasting against something ancient and enormous and patient in ways that human institutions are not equipped to be patient. But Isaac Clarke is still alive. And in this universe, that is not nothing. That is, perhaps, everything. You have reached the end. The Ishimura is dark and drifting somewhere near Aegis VII. The Sprawl is gone, its debris scattered in the rings of Saturn. Tau Volantis is frozen, the machine broadcasting, the moons receding into the deep space between stars. Isaac Clarke is somewhere, alive, carrying everything the way people do. And you are here, in whatever quiet place you have found for this journey, at the end of a long night of dark stories told gently. The universe is very large and very old, and contains things that are beyond the scale of any individual life. This is true in the Dead Space universe, and it is true in the real one. The darkness outside your window is the same darkness that Isaac Clarke looked up at on Tau Volantis, full of things you cannot see, ancient beyond understanding, are indifferent to your small and specific existence. And you are still here, warm, breathing, alive. That is not nothing. That is everything. Sleep well.